Welcome to another deep dive. We like to go deep, and that's what we do here
Yeah.
efficiently.
Yeah.
You're here because you appreciate that.
Yeah.
You like to get to the bottom of things, find those little aha moments. Today,
That's it.
it's Joseph Ibn Kaspi. Now, this is a medieval philosopher.
Right. Yeah.
And we'll get to all that.
Sure.
But his ideas are still relevant to philosophy today.
Yeah.
Which is amazing.
Yeah.
We're going to be using the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy entry on Kaspi for this one.
Great source.
Yeah.
Really good overview. And it speaks to, to a philosophical audience specifically because of this intersection between philosophy and scripture. He really saw philosophy as a way to understand scripture, a tool.
And he was prolific.
Yeah, he was.
Around 30 works.
Wow.
And many are unpublished.
Right.
Or even lost.
Oh, interesting.
Well, there's this real sense of discovery here.
Absolutely. Like a whole world of thought that's still waiting to be...
Exactly.
Right, to be opened.
Yeah. So let's start with the basics. Who was this guy?
Okay.
The Stanford entry outlines kind of 3 periods of his life.
Mm-hmm.
The first one takes us from his birth around 1280 to this kind of pivotal but also kind of disappointing trip to Egypt in 1314. So he was in his early 30s, right?
Right.
What stands out to you about this trip? Why was it so important?
I think this trip to Egypt is really interesting because he went there looking for high-level intellectual engagement, specifically with Maimonides, and he was disappointed. When he got there, he was like, this isn't what I thought it was going to be. And so that was really formative for him. It spurred him on to start producing his own works.
Oh, I see. So it's this kind of oh, I'm going to show them kind of a moment.
I'm going to show them how it's done.
Okay. All right. And then we move to the second period.
Okay.
His second Byzantine period.
Yeah.
From 1314 to 1330. This is a much more settled time. He's got family life. He's writing. He's publishing.
Right.
This is when we see his early work, most notably Tarek Kisef.
Right.
But his ideas, they weren't universally embraced, were they?
Well, there was some criticism early on from, other scholars in Ceylon. And this indicates that, he was ruffling some feathers already.
Oh,
He was coming up with new interpretations that not everyone was happy with.
So he's already making a name for himself.
Right, exactly.
Okay. And then the final period,
okay,
this is the Spanish period.
Mm-hmm.
This is from 1330 until his death in Majorca in 1345.
Right.
And again, this is a really productive period, particularly in logic and linguistics.
Yeah.
He produces works like Error, Hakasef, Retukot Kisef, and Sharshat Kisef.
Wow, those titles.
Yeah.
I mean, even the titles themselves are...
Yeah, what is it about the titles?
Bundle of Silver, Chains of Silver.
Okay.
I mean, it speaks to this kind of preciousness of logic and language and how he saw them as really important tools, right?
So he really saw these as the foundational tools for inquiry.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay. Interesting. Now, beyond the basic biography,
right,
the entry emphasizes his really broad education. He was proficient in multiple languages.
Yes, Hebrew, Provençal, probably Arabic, Latin.
Okay, so really a polyglot.
Citizen of the world.
Yeah.
Intellectually, at least.
Yeah, and he was deeply familiar with not just the classical Jewish texts.
Yes.
But also Maimonides, Averroes, Aristotle, Avicenna, Plato. I mean, this is a wide range of influences.
Yeah.
But he himself admitted that he had limited knowledge of halakhic literature.
That's interesting.
So what do we make of that?
So for me, as a philosopher, that really points to his primary orientation as being towards philosophical reasoning and interpretation rather than legalistic traditions.
I see.
So he's not so much concerned with the legal details as he is with the concepts and with the arguments.
So now we get to the real heart of his work.
Okay.
This is his approach to exegesis.
Right.
He called himself a commentator, a parash. And his goal was to uncover the author's true intention.
Right.
Now, that's tricky.
Yeah, it is.
Especially when you're talking about the Bible, where the author is...
Well, divine.
Right. So how do you...
Yeah, how do you...
uncover the...
How do you even approach that
Good God.
As a human, right? With limited cognitive abilities.
Yeah. And Kaspi recognized this difficulty, right?
Yeah.
He even suggested that.
It's almost like a form of prophecy
to
be able to grasp the Torah's intention.
Really? So he's saying it's like this almost mystical endeavor.
Right. You can't just think your way to it.
You have to have some kind of like divine inspiration.
Almost, yeah.
Okay. But then he also says this really interesting thing. He says that while the original intention might be complex or even obscure, right?
Yeah.
The commentator's truth ultimately resides in the reader's understanding.
So there's a subjectivity.
Yeah. Doesn't this introduce a huge element of subjectivity?
It does.
Yeah.
But it's not radical relativism.
Okay.
You know, he does say that there are moments of certainty when you can discern the author's intent.
How you do that?
Through coherence. So when the different parts of the text are consistent with each other.
So you're looking for like internal consistency.
Right. And this actually, you know, echoes Aristotle.
Oh, interesting.
And even some Talmudic thought where they say words of truth are recognizable.
Oh, okay.
Like you can tell when something is true.
So this idea of like coherence as a mark of truth.
Right.
Okay. And that's how you get at the author's intention.
That's one way to do it.
Okay. But it's interesting. He also had this very traditional view of how the biblical text was transmitted.
Right.
He believed that it had remained unchanged.
Right.
Since the Second Temple period.
Second Temple period. Yes. Unchanged. That's a pretty...
So there's no corruptions.
Right.
There's no...
No scribal errors.
Yeah, exactly.
Right. That's fascinating.
It is. It is. It speaks to a kind of a real reverence for the text, right?
So he's using reason.
Yeah.
But he's also relying on...
tradition as well.
Yeah, tradition.
Yeah, right.
This is a real interesting mix.
Yeah.
Okay. And then he distinguishes between early sages who, for him, reflect the Torah writer's original intent and later rabbinic authorities whose interpretations...
can be questioned if they deviate from the plain meaning.
Right. So the early sages have a kind of...
Or authority.
They're closer to the source.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
And the later ones, maybe they got it wrong.
So we can actually critique them.
Right.
Yeah.
Based on this principle of coherence and plain meaning.
Okay. Now this focus on plain meaning seems really important for Kaspi, especially given his interest in logic.
Right. And
he does give two key definitions of logic, doesn't he?
He does. He says that logic is, first of all, about determining whether a belief is correct or not.
Okay.
So it's not about how we form beliefs, but it's about whether those beliefs are justified.
Okay.
So it's a normative discipline. It's not
descriptive.
Not descriptive, And then secondly, he says that logic is about determining the proper use of language.
So it's not just about...
It's a convention.
It's grammar, right? It's about something deeper.
It's about a universal...
Universal what?
Universal syntax.
The universal syntax. So like a structure that underlies all language.
Right.
Okay. That's
huge.
That is a huge claim.
Yeah.
Wow. Okay. And he was also
criticized.
Yeah, very critical of predecessors because they neglected logic in their interpretations.
Right. They weren't rigorous enough.
So they weren't being rigorous enough.
Right.
Okay. Oh. And this led him to write his own work on logic, Exegesis.
Right.
And it was a concise...
Yeah, concise, very focused on the principles that are relevant
to biblical interpretation.
Right. So he leaves out all the stuff that's not relevant.
Like what? What kind of stuff?
Like rhetoric and poetics.
Oh.
Things that are more about...
Persuasion.
Right. Yeah. He's not interested in that.
He just wants to get at the truth.
He wants to get to the truth.
Right.
Okay? And he didn't just theorize about logic.
No.
He actually used it.
He used it.
Yeah, in his own exegetical work.
Right.
So the entry
gives... sorts of examples.
Yeah, all these specific examples.
Categorization.
Okay.
Distinguishing essence from accident. Symmetry of relations.
Okay.
The law of non-contradiction.
Right.
Analysis of syllogisms and fallacies.
He's got the whole
box.
Toolkit, Yeah.
And there's one example that really stands out.
Yeah.
This is his analysis of Genesis 2.5.
Oh, yeah.
Where he uses it to challenge interpretations that conflict with Aristotelian cosmology.
Right. So she's saying...
So he's bringing Aristotle into the mix.
To interpret the Bible.
Okay. So he's not afraid to use philosophy to interpret Scripture.
Yeah. That's his whole project.
Right. Yeah. That is his whole project. All right. But it doesn't stop there.
Yeah.
He also
goes even deeper.
Goes deeper into the relationship between logic and the Hebrew language.
Right.
So he has some...
And this is where he gets really interesting.
Yeah, really interesting.
Because he argues that...
that Hebrew is not just a conventional language.
Okay, so he's going against...
Yeah, he's going against...
Aristotle here.
It's Aristotle. He's saying that there's something special about Hebrew.
Okay.
That there's a connection between the sounds and the forms of the words and the qualities
like objects they denote.
of the objects.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
So it's not arbitrary.
It's like there's a meaning embedded.
Right. There's a meaning embedded in the
language itself.
In the language itself. Okay. And he gives some examples, right? Like he links Adam to Adama, earth, Ish to Ish, fire, and Enosh to a root that suggests loss. So it's like there's this deeper connection.
Right. There's a correspondence between the word and the
thing.
And the thing itself.
Okay. That's fascinating.
Yeah. And then he takes it even further with this principle of generalization, which comes from the logical distinction between the universal and the particular.
Okay.
And he says that this allows for linguistic economy. So like we don't have to say everything. Right. We can be more concise.
Yeah. And this leads him to some really surprising interpretations.
Of Hebrew grammar.
Right. So like instances where
gender agreement isn't strictly necessary.
Right. Or where singular forms can be used for plurals.
Right.
Past tense can be used for the future. And even
where standard syntax.
Yeah, where standard syntax is just absent.
Yeah.
Okay. So he's really like breaking down these grammatical rules.
Right. And he's saying that it's not because the Hebrew language is flawed.
Okay.
It's because there's a deeper
logic at play.
Yeah,
okay. Wow. Yeah. And this exploration of Hebrew
leads to
his dictionary, Sharshat Kisef.
Right.
Where he starts with this really interesting idea.
That every Hebrew word is distinct.
It's
distinct.
There are no
true synonyms.
There's no true synonyms or homonyms.
Okay,
that's a big
claim.
That's a big claim. And then his first key principle is this idea of
the common denominator.
Yeah. Which is that
every root has a core meaning.
That unifies all its
derived forms.
Okay.
Even if those meanings seem very different on the surface.
Okay.
So he gives an example of DLEM-I. Oh, okay.
Which means both opposition.
Okay.
And bread. So how do you...
And he connects it to...
though.
Aristotle's concept of food as the contrary of what is consumed.
Oh, okay.
Right, so the food...
So it's like a resistance.
Yeah, like a resistance. The food is resisting being consumed.
Okay, why?
Yeah, right. It's pretty wild.
That's a wild interpretation. Yeah. Okay.
But he's really committed to this idea of coherence in language.
Okay. And then the second key principle is this rejection.
Of absolute synonymy.
So
he says there are no
two words to mean exactly the same thing.
mean exactly the same thing. Right. So he
really gets into like the nuance.
Right.
How
words differentiates them in really subtle ways. And he's not just talking about different
things.
Yeah. Right. Or different contexts.
Yeah.
He's saying that they can refer to the same reference.
The same thing.
But they emphasize different aspects
of the same thing.
Of that thing.
Okay. So give me an example.
So he gives the example of different Hebrew words for cutting instruments. So you have Harev, Sakin, Makaleth, Shelah. Now
they all mean cutting instrument.
Right. They all have subtle differences. Okay, so what are the differences?
So Harev relates to destruction.
Okay.
Sakin is just the act of cutting, Hateleth, is slaughter.
Oh, I see. Right.
Yeah, okay.
So there's a nuance.
So it's like the purpose for which the thing is used changes
its meaning.
The meaning of the word. Right. Even though they all refer to the same basic action of cutting. Okay. And then finally, his dictionary has a really unique structure.
Right. He prioritizes nouns over verbs.
Okay, nouns over verbs.
That's interesting. Why did he do that?
He has this whole theory of language in Kisef.
Okay.
Where he says that language develops from the most abstract concepts, which are represented by nouns, to the more concrete actions,
which are verbs,
which are represented by verbs.
Right.
So the nouns are like the building blocks of reality.
I see.
Right.
Yeah, so he's saying that nouns are
more
fundamental to verbs.
Than verbs, okay.
Right.
That's really interesting.
Yeah, so it all goes back to his...
So the structure of the dictionary reflects his...
His philosophy of language.
Philosophy of language.
Yeah.
Okay. Fascinating. Now, shifting gears a little bit.
Okay.
Let's talk about his theology.
Okay.
And anthropology. And here we see a very strong Aristotelian influence.
Very strong, yeah. He
sees God as the necessary, the unmoved mover.
Mm-hmm.
Pure intellect contemplating itself.
Okay.
Very Aristotelian.
Okay. And he even has this interesting quote about intellect being God.
Right. And that we bring God into our mind.
We bring God into our minds through intellect.
Right. So there's
so it's like a very close connection.
Very close connection.
Between God and
between human intellect.
The human mind.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah.
And then
he compares
this Aristotelian God to the Christian Holy Trinity.
Oh, wow. Which is
that's surprising.
A surprising move
for a medieval Jewish philosopher.
But a medieval Jewish philosopher.
Right. To even consider the Trinity.
To even consider it.
Right.
And then he extends this kind of naturalistic approach to his understanding of creation and miracles.
So
he doesn't believe in creation ex nihilo.
Right. He thinks that the world was not created out of nothing.
At a specific moment in time.
Right.
Okay. And he sees miracles
as natural events.
Natural events. Yeah. Not as violations of natural law, but as just rare occurrences.
Right.
That we don't understand.
That we don't fully understand because we don't have...
Because of our limited...
The scientific knowledge.
Knowledge. Right. Okay. And he even suggests that
prophets
through their knowledge of nature,
through their deep understanding of the natural world,
could perform what appear to be miracles.
Right.
Okay.
So they're not actually violating.
So they're not breaking the laws of nature.
They're just using using them in ways that
we don't understand.
We don't yet understand. Right. Okay. So it's like advanced science.
Advanced science.
Right.
Okay. And then he also talks about the relationship between
prophecy and wisdom. Yeah.
So he agrees
with Albalusi. Right.
That
the prophetic soul
is superior to the philosophical soul. But he maintains that prophecy
is based on deductive reasoning.
Not some kind of
irrational intuition. Right.
So he's giving this very rational explanation.
Right. He's trying to naturalize prophecy.
Yeah, naturalize prophecy. Okay. And then he takes this even further with the problem of
divine foreknowledge
and free will.
Right.
This is a classic
problem.
Philosophical problem.
Yeah.
How do you reconcile God's knowledge of the future with our ability to choose freely?
Right.
And Kaspi has an answer.
He does. He uses the analogy of wise person who can predict someone's behavior based on their character.
I see.
Right.
Okay.
So he's saying
God can
see our character
and therefore know how we're going to choose. But we're still choosing freely. Okay. But then he goes even further than that.
Yeah.
And suggests that God is the
remote mover.
Even in cases of sin.
Right, even when we sin. God is somehow
behind it.
Right, he gives the example of Pharaoh's hardened heart.
Okay, yeah.
Right.
So that's a really strong claim.
That's a strong claim. Yeah.
Okay, now let's talk about his views on human beings.
Right, anthropology.
All
right.
And here he gives some interesting guidelines for living a virtuous life.
Right.
And they're kind of utilitarian.
Yeah, kind of utilitarian.
And even egoistic.
Yeah, there's definitely an element of self-interest.
So what are some of those guidelines?
Well, he emphasizes education, self-development. He says family is important.
Okay.
But it's really